Okay, done the paternal line Applegate, which is one of the main families going back. Probably the Wardells are the one I know the most about next, but figured do it in semi-order, and we've done the paternal. Let's do the maternal. Uh, Now, this is a little bit interesting because Catherine Wardell taught me most about the paternal line. Uh, my mother was a nurse and worked nights, so I spent an awful lot of time next door at the house that my brothers and I inherited that we just sold last year. That house was, 150 years old. It had been moved across the lakes to Central Avenue where it was when I was a child, and where it still is for a while anyway. They haven't torn it down yet, but it was a general store in town by the the old post office, by the Catholic Church, which is still there. This Lakewood I'm talking about. And Catherine had regaled me with stories my whole life about the Wardells and the Applegates, and she didn't know much about the Burges. And my mother didn't know much about the Burges either. She always sort of looked down on telling stories about your family and stuff because, she didn't care about any Burge that she didn't know personally. She hadn't met in her life, so she didn't care who her great grandfather was or anything. She didn't, and it turns out it's funny because the Burges have the deepest history of all. You can go back further with the Burges than you can with anybody else. But I grew up thinking that the Burges were a farming family from Farmingdale, Squonkam, and that they hadn't really done anything remarkable, as opposed to the Wardells, who had been from everything from the Salem witch trials to a Lenape war on Wardell's Neck in Bricktown, and many stories I heard there. So turns out the Burges, even though my mother didn't know it and didn't care about it, the Burges have just as deep a history, in fact, deeper history than, well, it's as deep a history as you're going to find in Northern European genealogy. I'm Gary William Applegate, as I was last chapter. Here's my wife and my child, Catherine Applegate and Joanne Zabranik. My mother is Marjorie Burge. She's still alive. She still lives in Lakewood. We're trying to sell her house there next door to the Wardell Applegate house I was talking about, but that was moved, but it hasn't sold yet. Her father was Johnny Burge. Johnny Burge had been a sheriff's officer in Ocean County. His brother was a well-known politician. Yippee Burge was a well-known politician in Ocean County. Her mother was Mildred Compton. I've already talked about last chapter a little bit about the Comptons going and being connected to the Applegates, but we're not doing the Comptons now. We're doing the Burges. But Johnny Burge's father was Rufus Burge. Rufus Burge worked on the railroad. And let me give you a picture here. This is my mother. That's my mother as a young lady. I think she was a nurse recruit then, maybe. This is Johnny Burge, her father, who was a gambler. He was a sheriff's officer. He had a big garden, like one of his grandsons. He was a little bit of a hustler. Like I said, his brother was a politician, so he got involved in some things. I have I inherited from him document from New York where he went up to New York to pick up an extradited prisoner that was signed by Franklin Roosevelt when he was governor of New York. His father was Rufus Burge. Rufus worked on the railroad and died in Lakewood, but he was born in Squonkam at the Burge farm. That's Rufus. He's got a little bit of Johnny in him. Got a nice mustache. I think Rufus may have had reddish hair. And his father was Jonathan Longstreet Burge. Now, the Longstreet is his mother's maiden name. That's one of the habits that you find back here, is that often a middle name is the mother's maiden name. So Jonathan Longstreet Burge was Rufus's father. He was Elizabeth Longstreet's son, and Joseph Burge was his father. Jonathan fought in the American Civil War. He was a 35, 40-year-old private. The Longstreet name that you see here is interesting because it is, the most famous Longstreet, of course, is Pete General James Longstreet, Lee's right-hand man or left-hand man. Jackson was his right-hand man. The two great generals under Robert E. Lee were Longstreet and Jackson. And Elizabeth is Longstreet's third cousin, which makes me his third cousin, 5 times removed or whatever. Longstreet's, Elizabeth's great uncle had moved to South Carolina, and his son and then James were born in South Carolina. We'll do the Longstreets another day. That's probably chapter 10 or 11. We'll get into them. They are an interesting. It's not Longstreet, by the way. It's Langstraat. Langestraat. It's a Dutch name, German name. Okay? And they anglicized it to Longstreet. So Pete Longstreet should have been General James T. Langestraat. Okay. But we're looking at Joseph Burge. 1791 in Howell, that's actually out by Squonkam. He died in Farmingdale, which is Squonkam. That's where the Burge farm was. His father was Jonathan Burge. Notice Jonathan, Joseph. Jonathan, 1765. He was born in Squonkam. His father was also Joseph, 1742, again in Farmingdale. His father was Joseph, 1723, died about 1783. Now, before we go any further, I want to mention one person. Joseph Burge was married to Sarah Morris. Sarah Morris, although she was 9 or 10 generations removed from kings and princes, was a Plantagenet. I'm not sure she knew that she had royal blood, but when we do Sarah Morris, it's going to be a long chapter because it's all the royalty of Europe going back to the Roman Empire. It can be traced through Sarah Morris. And she lived on a farm in Squonkam and had, a dozen kids with Joseph Burge. She's my sixth great-grandmother, which makes her 8 generations back. But if you go 8 or 9 generations back from her, you're walking with kings and dukes. I don't know how she got here. She was a Plantagenet. Okay, Joseph's father was David, 1703. His father was also David, 1670. His father was Jonathan Burge. Jonathan Burge came to America in 1660 or so, settled not in New England, but in New York. And when New Jersey was opened up, him and his son David came to Middletown, which is, Squonkam was in Middletown for all intents and purposes, and Farmingdale, and built a farm, and they stayed on that farm until Rufus, all the way here. And then by the turn of the 20th century, farming was falling by the wayside. Rufus was working for the railroad. All these guys were farmers, but there was a famous Burge during the Revolution who was a highwayman, a Tory highwayman who was hung at Monmouth Courtyard, but he doesn't appear to be any in the direct line. He was probably a cousin, but he was probably from one of the Squonkam Burges. John Atch Burgess is as far back as I go. He was Jonathan Burge's father. He didn't come to America. He was in England and he stayed in England. I haven't gone any further back than him. He was born in 1620. And that's the Burge line. As I get into sort of the subfamilies, you'll see why I call the Burges the most historical of all, particularly following the Morris family, Sarah Morris's family, back through the Cornells and the Greys into the Plantagenet. There's also the Gifford line in the Burges, the subfamilies. I'm going to do the Wardells next, but each individual, as we go back, each one opens up another family group. And the Giffords and the Wardells, when I do next chapter, the Wardells, you're going to see Anniah Gifford in there, and the Burges are descended from him. And again, another reason my mother and my father are cousins through the Wardells and the Giffords. But when we do the Sarah Morris, you're going to see that I can trace some of my mother's ancestors, some of the Burge ancestors, through the Morrises, all the way back to Roman times. In fact, the earliest I've gotten so far is Dukes in Armenia around 250 AD. So that's a long time ago. That's a long time ago.